The transfer window is shut. It's fair to say we didn't get what we wanted, but the positive is we can stop discussing baseless rumors and focus on the football moving forwards. However, on this episode of the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast, we're going to wrap up and have the final word on what we believe to have happened at the club over the course of the January window. Let's get into it. Hey, everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast with me, your host, Harry Symeou, coming to you live on this Tuesday, late afternoon / early evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I've just got back from Mikel Arteta's press conference, looking ahead to the Newcastle United game that was held, of course, at the Sober Realty Training Centre, otherwise known as London Colney. It'll always be London Colney in my heart. Anyway, just got back from there. Found it a really, really interesting visit, actually, because obviously, you know, you think about the performance and the result on Sunday and the high that everybody was on. And then you think about how maybe people were feeling yesterday when it sort of became the reality that Arsenal weren't going to bring that forward player in that I think we all agree they could do with going into sort of the business end of the season. So yeah, it's weird the way the mood went, like from right up here to sort of dipping quite dramatically. And I thought it was really, really interesting to go to London Colney today to try and gauge the mood a little bit, to speak to some people around the club, to speak to sort of fellow reporters and journalists, etc., and try and understand what the consensus appears to be. And I think the general consensus is that everybody is feeling a little bit underwhelmed by the way that the window went. Everybody recognizes the need for another striker because, as we pointed out on the last episode, we are literally one Kai Havertz injury away from essentially a disaster, right? That's the black and white of it, right? We've got one recognized striker in the team. We've got one player who can play that position comfortably, and people would even make the case and even make the argument that it's not his natural position, which causes doubt in the first place. Then you factor in the fact that now we're super reliant on him, and people are worried. You know, people are concerned, and rightly so. I'm not here to tell you not to be underwhelmed. I'm not here to tell you not to be concerned by how thin we've left ourselves in that centre forward position. But based on a really interesting piece that came out in The Athletic this morning, written by the brilliant James McNicholas, and based on what I believe to be the case, having kind of felt a few things out today, I want to try and break down what happened at Arsenal during this January transfer window. How did it all go down? How did we get from being quite positive and optimistic about bringing in a forward player to getting to the end of the window and having no one? How did it all unfold? That's what we're going to try and do on this episode of the podcast. We are going to bring you a full preview of the Newcastle United game at first thing tomorrow morning, bright and early. That'll be available to you. So make sure you join us for that one. We might even have to go live at something like, I don't know, maybe 8:30, something like that. I've got a funeral to attend tomorrow, so I need to be out of the house pretty early on in the day, but we will make sure that we squeeze the episode in nice and early, so you've got the whole day to listen to it. But yeah, look, we're going to try and break down what's happened. I did say that going forward, we're going to focus on the football rather than the transfer speculation that has, of course, dominated the conversation in Arsenal circles for a while now, and we will just after this episode, because I think it's really important that there's some closure first. So the Athletic's James Nicholas, as I mentioned, wrote a detailed explainer of what went on in the window for the Gunners. So we'll discuss the key points before turning our attention to Wednesday night's game. So here goes. So here are some of the key points that I've picked out, and as I say, we'll break them down sort of one by one. So according to this piece, Arsenal, and I quote, escalated their efforts to sign a striker after losing both Bukayo Saka and Gabriel Jesus. Now, this is a real point of contention, I think, among the fan base, okay? Because I've said on this podcast recently that my mindset with regards to what was needed and what we should prioritize changed over the course of January. At the beginning, I was looking at it and I was going, right, we need we need to get in a wide player because we've lost Bukayo Saka. And we need someone that can come in and do the business. We had Raheem Sterling waiting in the wings. I got to be honest, at that point, I didn't really believe that Ethan Nwaneri could do that role. I'll be honest, I should never write him off because he's such a wonderful talent, but I just never felt that Ethan Nwaneri was a kind of natural fit for that role. It turns out he is. Turns out he's doing a brilliant job when playing there. And obviously that has probably changed the viewpoint on how desperate we were for a wide player over the course of the window. Raheem Sterling just hasn't done it. That's the reality of the situation, okay? I'm not trying to dig out individuals. I'm not trying to go after him. I just don't think that signing has brought us the sort of upside that we hoped it would, okay? So my viewpoint was we need a winger. And then we lost Gabriel Jesus, and my viewpoint switched from a winger being the priority to a centre forward now being the priority. Why? Because outside of Kai Havertz, having lost Gabriel Jesus for the long term, there was nobody else. There is nobody else. There remains nobody else within the group that is a natural fit at centre forward. And you can talk about Martinelli playing there, and you can talk about Trossard playing there, and Raheem Sterling playing there, and Ethan Nwaneri playing there. These are all options that Mikel Arteta has mentioned as potential alternatives. But my response to every single one of those would be, okay, they are forward players, but do any of them have the capacity to hold the ball up the way that Kai Havertz does? No. Do any of them have the capacity to drop deep the way that Kai Havertz does? No. Do any of them have the capacity to support us defensively from set pieces the way Kai Havertz does? No. Some of them have got the power to run in behind. There's no doubt about the fact that Gabriel Martinelli has the pace to do that. But there are elements to his game that just don't really fit in with what we are currently asking from our centre forward. And so that means an adaptation in your style and an adaptation in the way that you play. And we saw a little bit of that earlier in the season when Martin Odegaard was out and we started playing with the kind of two false nines. It was more like a flat four in midfield. Trossard and Havertz were sort of rotating between false nine and that role just behind. And changing the way we played, it didn't really work for me. There were a few games where it worked because we were away from home and actually the onus wasn't necessarily on us to be front-footed throughout. And then maybe it suited us in those particular games, but we were desperate for Martin Odegaard to come back by the time he did. So I'm a big believer in having players that, of course, look, you want to have plan B, but I'm a big believer in having players that can bring continuity to the core principles of your game when maybe your first choice option is unavailable. And we just don't have that at centre forward. That is the reality. You can dress it up as much as you want and people will say, here he comes to do his Arsenal PR piece and all the rest of it. I am not for a second saying that we were right not to bring in a forward because that's not my opinion. And I wouldn't be true to myself if I tried to spin this in another way because I feel that that's what I should do. I don't feel under any pressure to say anything that, I don't want to say. I'm giving you my opinion, but I'm also, as we go through this information, trying to break down exactly what we think might have happened. And listen, we'll never know fully, right? Because we're not privy to conversations and we're only ever going to know what people want us to know, right? So I appreciate that. But can we try and paint a vague picture based on the reports that we have? Can we try and read between the lines and draw up some kind of conclusion as to how the window went? I think we can. And that's what we're trying to do. So my view, as I said, had changed over the course of the window. I went from feeling we desperately needed a winger to feeling that we desperately needed a centre forward. We were short going into the season, though, in the attacking positions. I know that people will say, yeah, but, we've lost Saka and we've lost Jesus. But I think we all knew that an out-and-out striker was something we could really do with. And I personally was surprised by the fact that we didn't get one last summer. Now, what was told to us at that point, or at least the way it was packaged up, was that there wasn't the right option available. And I kind of get that and I understand that. And we'll come on to that a little bit later on as we break down this Athletic piece. But, we kind of accepted the fact that we didn't sign a striker. And I guess if you go back to that point, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I never felt that it was something we were going to do in January. I thought it was something that we were going to do in the following summer. And so when it got to January and then we needed one, there was always a reluctance from me to really believe that we were going to go and drop a load of money on a player unless we could get one of those summer targets early, unless we could bring a bit of business forward. If we could do that, then maybe it could happen. But if we weren't going to do that, if we were going to pivot elsewhere, it was only going to be a short-term solution. That's how I saw it. As I say, I thought that when we lost Saka, we were already at a critical level of shortness. And when we lost Jesus, it became panic stations, right? That's where we got to. And we had to do something. We had to go out there and try and address that problem. Personally, I don't know that Arsenal didn't start their search after Saka's injury. I don't know that. I can't say with any degree of confidence that that was the case. But it does feel like, just based on kind of these reports and sort of, the way people are talking about it, that, we had a realization at the point that Jesus picked up that injury that, yeah, we're in a bit of trouble now. And it felt like we accelerated the process to sign a striker then, which in my opinion was too late. Because you might not have been dead set on going and bringing in a striker. You might not have been dead set on it being a centre forward, but the need for an attacker in general has existed for a long time. So that's where the frustration comes in from a lot of Arsenal fans, I think. It's also said in this piece that the club and the manager were aligned on the principle that they did not want to make a signing just for the sake of it. Now, generally speaking, I agree with this approach because, as I've said multiple times throughout this window, we didn't get here because we just spent frivolously each and every time we had a bit of trouble on players that we weren't convinced by. But at the same time, the situation got to, in my view, a critical point. Nobody would have called Arsenal out for veering away from the strategy just ever so slightly in order to protect the team's interest and to provide Kai Havertz with the support he needs. I've talked about it before, and I'll just quickly touch on it again. One of my big concerns is that Kai Havertz already divides opinion. Now, I think people that don't appreciate what Kai Havertz brings to this Arsenal side, sorry, but football's not for you. I would go as far as saying that. I think he's so important to this team. I think he brings so much to this team. Is there things that he could do better? Of course there are, but you could say that about every single player in the world. This idea that other strikers never miss chances, it's far-fetched, it's fantasy, and it's ridiculous, quite frankly, okay? If you don't rate Kai Havertz or at least appreciate or understand what he brings to the team, then you don't know what you're watching. I'm sorry. He needs protecting because with the opinion around him already divided, it isn't going to take much for people to get on his back, for people to start on him, and for people to point the finger at him, when the reality is he shouldn't have to carry that striking burden alone. There should be more. There should be more support, and there isn't. And that isn't on Kai Havertz. So if you are going to voice a frustration, if you are going to be vocal about your feelings around the striker situation at Arsenal, I don't know who the one individual is, and I don't condone ever going after one individual because I don't think it's a single point of failure. But I think that you have to be careful not to start on the player when the player is clearly giving his all, and I think has been given too much responsibility now. And he's going to take it on and he's going to try his best because that's what Kai Havertz is and that's the kind of guy he is. But we shouldn't be in that position in the first place. So just make sure that frustration is expressed in the right way would be my point around that. I'm not telling people you can't be frustrated. Just make sure that you're looking at it through the right lens is what I would say. On Watkins, which was a big story during this window, Arsenal hoped, according to this piece, to exploit a PSR situation to sign Watkins. But ultimately, Villa found another way to satisfy their needs. Me personally, I'd have offered more for Ollie Watkins, but the club, from what it sounds like, wasn't willing to get close to the £60 million that Villa had indicated they were looking for. But the truth is, who knows if they'd have even accepted that after the John Duran thing. After that developed, after it became clear that Al Nassr, who had made the point that they were interested in John Duran previously from what we're hearing, but there was never really that confidence that they would go ahead and do the deal. We hear a lot about Saudi interest all the time. And a lot of the time it doesn't materialize into anything. So you can understand why Villa were a little bit reluctant on that. But this is the thing, right? Because Watkins at 60 million, I know a lot of Arsenal fans, when I sort of talked about this news when it first broke, were like, 60 million quid for a 29-year-old, for someone that's going to be 30 in 2025, that is mad. That's crazy. We shouldn't do it. That, again, divided opinion. Arsenal had their set value or their set amount that they would go to for Ollie Watkins, but were never going to surpass that. And I don't think necessarily that's wrong. I would have signed him if it were up to me, but I can also see the counter argument. When the club's hierarchy met in LA back in November, and again, this is in that Athletic piece, their vision was to lean into the long term, to try and recruit development players who could flesh out the squad and deliver value over the coming years. Now, this meeting that is referenced, it took place in November. Now, I'm not saying that the club's hierarchy are not in constant contact, and I'm not saying that there weren't other meetings between November and obviously the end of this transfer window. But so much changed between November and January. We lost Bukayo Saka. We lost Gabriel Jesus. We had a whole load of other injuries. We were without Martin Odegaard for a period of time. There was a long period where we were just fighting injury after injury after injury. And when it became apparent that we lost even just Bukayo Saka, that should have been the trigger point for me to go out and try and strengthen the attack. It feels like we might have just acted a little bit too late. Again, I don't know that with any certainty, but that's kind of my feeling on this. We lost two key attacking players. And listen, having strategies and plans are great, but without being adaptable in a world as unpredictable as football, what do you have is the question that I would ask. We talk about development players, and there were two names mentioned in this piece: Sverre Nypan, the Norwegian who's decided to stay at Rosenborg, and Victor Reis. Those were two targets that Arsenal had in mind. Nypan decided to remain at Rosenborg, and Reis signed for Manchester City. Now, Reis, according to what Arsenal knew at the time, according to this report, would have cost around about £30 million. And he was seen as a player that could future-proof the defense. But Arteta had concerns about spending that amount of money on somebody who wouldn't be a difference maker this season. And I completely agree with that. If you're in a healthy position as a squad and there isn't that glaring need, and you've got a bit of money to spend, and you want to start putting the pieces in place to future-proof your group and future-proof your team, by all means do it. But you can't justify spending £30 million on Victor Reis when you have a gaping hole at centre forward. So I think Mikel Arteta was right to put his foot down and say, I don't think this is going to work for us. So in the window now, we're looking for a striker. Alexander Isak, out of reach, according to The Athletic. The response from inquiries made around Sesko were not encouraging. Watkins, I'll go back to that. Apparently, the possibility was first floated between the two club hierarchies at the league game between the sides on January 18th. This suggests that Villa were open. This suggests, if you read between the lines, that Aston Villa were willing to sell Ollie Watkins. And if they weren't, would Arsenal have gone as far as making the offer that they did? Villa were already, as I've already mentioned, in contact with Al Nassr over Duran, but they had doubts over whether or not that would materialize. Villa needed to sell one or the other. They needed to satisfy that PSR need. Arteta, according to this report, jumped at the idea of Watkins, although he'd never previously featured on Arsenal's recruitment list. Now, this is an interesting point because for years and years and years, we've heard Watkins. Arteta loves him, etc., etc. But it turns out that he was never really on the list. And was that because of the age factor, which we've already touched on? Probably, because there's no doubt he's a really, really good player. Not everybody within the club agreed it was wise to spend a sizable fee on a player who turns 30 this year, but Mikel Arteta got his way. A recruitment meeting took place. Josh Kroenke reportedly flew in, and Arsenal made their move. Now, this is where I'm a little bit baffled, because there you have the club's hierarchy looking at the option of Ollie Watkins, who has been, by the sounds of it, maybe not, I wouldn't go as far as saying offered to them, but is being sort of pushed in that direction by Aston Villa, from what it sounds like. You got the club hierarchy that are looking at that and going, 29 years old, nearly 30, don't want to spend that money. Mikel Arteta is desperate to get a forward in, as I think he made very, very clear throughout the course of the transfer window. And he looks at this and goes, do it. This is the guy. Do it. Get it done. He'll be a real big asset. Get him in. I know people want to point finger at the owners, and I've done that plenty in the past. And although Arteta got his way in terms of Arsenal actually sanctioning an approach for Ollie Watkins, did he get his way in terms of the club being as on board as they could have been? Because if they were as on board with this as Mikel Arteta was, then might they have been willing to push the boat out that little bit further in terms of the fee to get the signing done? I'd imagine the £40 million offer that we heard about was a kind of starting point rather than an end point. I'm sure Arsenal were willing to go a little bit further, but perhaps not as far as Aston Villa were waiting for them to, so that they would sanction a deal. It's a hard one, right? Because it's one of two things. Either the club said they'll go in, but with very, very strict conditions because they were not totally convinced, which says that Mikel Arteta doesn't have all the power and isn't solely responsible for this lack of a striker coming in. Or Villa were being unreasonable. I don't know. I don't know. The point I'm trying to make here is that it's all good saying that you're going to go in for the player. But obviously that was driven by Mikel Arteta. But how serious are you in that intention? If you're really serious in that intention, then you wouldn't mind, or you at least find a way, don't you, to try and make that deal happen, even if it means costing a little bit more than you'd like. And this is the thing, like, there needs to be a unanimous agreement, it feels, at Arsenal Football Club. And that's, I guess, how it should work. You shouldn't have one person calling on all the shots. You should have people there that can sanity check, the manager's ideas, for instance, just to make sure that they're also aligned with the best interests of the football club. Because we've seen many, many times before, not at our football club necessarily, but at others, where managers have gone in, spent a load of money, and brought in a load of players that, once that particular manager leaves, are no good to anybody else because they've been bought for a very specific style or system, etc., etc. So you should always have a sanity check in place. You should always have someone checking the decision. I agree with that. But was it a case of Arsenal saying, yeah, you know what, Mikel, we like him, let's have a go, but we ain't spending any more than 40 million quid on him? It might have been the case. It might have been the case. I do think that this deal was dead anyway. And so I think the question over whether or not Arsenal as a football club were willing to go far enough to get it done becomes a bit of a moot one, actually, when you think about the fact that by the time we learned of the news that Arsenal had approached Aston Villa for Ollie Watkins, the deal was dead. The deal was dead because Duran was already on his way to Al Nassr. So, yeah, it's really hard to kind of decipher all of this, isn't it? But my point is that, just like I was talking about Kai Havertz, okay, you can sit and look at Mikel Arteta and say, he's a failure. He didn't get what we needed in this window. But this evidences, I think, that football is far more complex than that. That there are way more sort of cooks in the kitchen, and it isn't just about one man's want. If it was about one man's want, then I think that's a really unhealthy environment, actually, because you're essentially giving the keys to one person and saying, you're in charge, you're in control. And that is not the way that you breed high standards. High standards require multiple parties to be on the same page and to keep each other humble, to keep each other at that level without ever allowing that standard to drop. So I don't have a problem with other people sort of coming into it and maybe putting their foot down. We know that, or at least we heard that there was a problem in the summer over the Mikel Merino deal, where some people within the club didn't feel that he was worth that investment because of his age, etc., etc. So if this did happen with Ollie Watkins, that's at least consistent with what we know to be the case previously, right? So you're thinking about the long term, you're thinking about sell-on value, etc., etc. When Arsenal were in Girona the other night, according to this piece, the Gunners met with Joan Garcia's representatives, a player that they intend to go back in for later this year. And in that same meeting, Arsenal expressed an interest in another of the representatives' clients, Alvaro Morata. Arsenal, according to this piece, were beaten to the punch by Galatasaray because we wanted to take stock. We weren't particularly sort of pushy about it. We didn't, by the sounds of things, make our minds up quick enough, and we weren't decisive enough around the idea of bringing Alvaro Morata in such a short window. Guys, you can't afford to be indecisive. Like, you got to identify a target, and if you want him, you got to go out and do it, because it's a very short window. It's not like this summer where, you know, when the season ends in May, conversations start taking place. In fact, conversations probably happen way before that. And then you've got all of June and all of July, and then you've got all of August. It doesn't work like that in the January window. It's a very short one. It's just 1 month. And therefore, you've got to be decisive in your decisions. I like Alvaro Morata. I would have tried to sign him. I've said that before on here. I've been laughed at when I've said that on here before. But I really do. I do believe that he would have been a good option. Not to start. That's not what I'm saying here. But over the course of the window, I made peace with the idea that we weren't going to bring in a starter. And I got into the mindset of thinking, right, we are at critical stage now. You need to support Kai Havertz. And I think Alvaro Morata, who in a lot of ways can play in a similar way to Kai Havertz, I think would have been a good replacement or cover for him. Kai Havertz can't play every single minute of every single game between now and the end of the season. That is asking too much of him. And he might be incredibly robust and really physical and always, touch wood, in great condition. But that is a lot to ask of him. You know, he's got to take on that goal scoring burden now without the support. And he's going to have to play a hell of a lot of minutes. Evan Ferguson was another name that people were talking about. That deal was impossible because Arsenal, who had an interest in him previously, were not willing to pay for a permanent deal. But because of the fact that we'd taken Sterling and Neto on loan, we couldn't do it. And with regards to Matisse Tel, Arsenal, according to this piece, didn't feel that he could do a job as a 9, and that was their priority. Also, that his relative inexperience made it unlikely he'd be able to assist the team straight away. Fair enough, I suppose. You know, you're looking at that deal that took Matisse Tel from Bayern Munich to Tottenham Hotspur, and Tottenham was celebrating that yesterday as if it was this cracking bit of business. Look, it might prove to be, but what's come to light today is that they paid about 10 million to get that loan done, etc., etc., and they're going to pay a fair chunk of money to him in salary as well. So, you know, not as risk-free in terms of the deal on the whole as maybe it was put out to be. So that's what we think happened during this window, right? So to summarize, Arsenal were given encouragement by Aston Villa that Ollie Watkins was available, hence why they made the offer. Was the offer enough to get Ollie Watkins out of Aston Villa? It kind of doesn't matter, because Aston Villa ended up selling John Duran to Al Nassr, which closed the door on an Ollie Watkins exit. But had Arsenal been a bit more decisive around that, had Arsenal gone in with a figure closer to what Villa wanted, maybe they get that done and wrapped up in time, and the Duran thing doesn't matter. I don't know. I really don't know, right? But that's how I see that. Alvaro Morata is somebody that they explored the possibility of signing. But from what I've heard today, I don't think there was anything more than just a question being asked in that. This piece does say that Arsenal had sort of made an inquiry about Benjamin Sesko's availability in this window, but they didn't receive a particularly encouraging response. And so Arsenal have decided to keep their powder dry. And I get all sorts of comments in the chat, right? And the chat's become really toxic during this transfer window. And it always does during the transfer window, because there's frustration, I understand, but it's rubbish like this, right? Your spin don't work with me, Harry. I'm not spinning anything, mate. I've said throughout the show, and I've said throughout the course of the window, that in my opinion, and it is just my opinion, Arsenal need an attacker. It's clear that Mikel Arteta's opinion was that Arsenal needed an attacker, because he said as much time and time and time again. But it's also clear that Arsenal didn't feel, rightly or wrongly. That is up to you to judge and decide. It's nothing to do with me. I've given you my opinion. My opinion is that we needed to add and we haven't, right? So I can't look at this window in a positive light. I can't. Maybe come the end of the season, if we have the success that I want us to, I'll be able to move on from it, and I'll look back at it and go, my God, we managed to achieve what we achieved without that. And the club were right not to panic, because look, this summer, we've got a shiny new striker, the one that we really want, not the one that we settled for at the end of a January window because we were desperate. Nobody's spinning anything. Nobody's trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. This is what The Athletic reported this morning. You can read it yourself. What we are trying to do is read between the lines and try and paint a vague picture with regards to what happened. There are points in this, right, that I agree with. So we talked about Arsenal escalating their efforts to sign a striker after losing both Saka and Gabriel Jesus. Me personally, I think they needed to escalate their efforts after they lost Saka. I don't know that they didn't do that, but if it only sort of clicked into gear after the Jesus injury, that's too late for me. I said I generally agree with the principle of not signing players just for the sake of it. But we were at a critical point. We are at a critical point where we probably should have just veered away from the strategy a little bit in order to do what we needed to do. I talked about the club's meeting of the hierarchy back in LA, which was again referenced in this piece. And I made the point that to me feels a little bit irrelevant because lots has changed between November and January. Sverre Nypan hasn't signed. We were trying to get him and we haven't been able to convince him to sign. Victor Reis, was being looked at. He's gone to Manchester City. But I agree with the fact that we didn't feel it was right to spend 30 million quid on him when we had a gaping hole in attack. I think if Arsenal offered more for Ollie Watkins in the first place, maybe that deal gets done before John Duran is on his way to Al Nassr. I will never know. I am speculating. I am just sharing my opinion. But also, I understand why there would have been a reluctance to drop 60 million quid on a 29-year-old who's going to turn 30 later this year. And I said about the Morata thing, if it's true that Arsenal did open that line of communication, that the fact that they were clearly indecisive in this has allowed him to go and join Galatasaray. And there's no way on God's green earth that Alvaro Morata picks Galatasaray over Arsenal if both options are on the table. So indecision has caused us a problem as well. But you're indecisive when you don't see the right option in front of you. And Mikel Arteta told us today that the club tried everything, that the club were desperate to get the right player in, but only the right player and not just a player for the sake of it. And I suppose, to a point, we have to trust them. If it goes belly up and come the end of the season, we're struggling to score goals, Kai Havertz picks up an injury, God forbid, or something like that, then we'll be well within our rights to look back at this window and say Arsenal failed in not recruiting, and that failure to recruit has cost us. But this thing that people do where they go into full outrage mode before seeing how something plays out is weird to me. Like, you can have your concern. I've got concerns. It's like I was speaking to a neighbor of mine earlier, right? And her son was outside playing on his bike, right? And he was riding around like their front garden sort of thing. And she was like, "Oh, I'm so annoyed with him riding it around the front garden. He's going to go into the wall." And I'm like, okay, you're concerned that he's going to ride the bike into the wall, right? Because he just learned how to ride a bike, young lad. But it hasn't happened yet. So, you want to do what you can to mitigate that risk. And you want to do what you can to make sure that you get the outcome that you want. But also, being outraged by something that hasn't happened yet is a weird mindset to me. I can't get my head around it. If we manage to achieve something big this season without having signed a striker, all of the people that lost their minds over the course of this last 2 weeks will look ridiculously stupid. Ridiculously stupid. So let's see what happens. Let's see what happens now. I've made my point. I think we needed to sign. We haven't. I can't change that. So I choose not to live the rest of the season being angry about something that hasn't caused us an issue yet. Let's see how we get on. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how it goes. And also this other thing, right, as well. Like, and we made this point on yesterday's podcast very, very clearly. This idea that it is just down to the centre forward to score goals, it's in this team anyway, it's flawed because this team has not been built that way. And we've touched on this point quite a bit over the last sort of few weeks, but you've got Liverpool who have goals from Mo Salah. You've got goals from Cody Gakpo at a much higher rate than any of our wingers are producing. You've got goals from Luis Diaz. You've got goals from Jota. And then you've got a few others chipping in here and there. But the Liverpool front line generally on the whole, and I know they've only scored a handful of Premier League goals more than us, but those players are contributing a lot more. And so what you should be looking at when worrying whether or not Arsenal have enough goals within the group is you should be looking at Trossard's return this season. You should be looking at Martinelli's return this season. You should be looking at Odegaard's return this season. You should be looking at Declan Rice's return this season, all of whom have dropped off, by the way, in terms of what they're giving us, in terms of outputs. My concern for Kai Havertz is not about the number of goals that he's scoring, because he is scoring a good amount of goals and he's way out in front in terms of our top goal scorer list. He's the least of my concerns within that group when it comes to can he score enough goals. That's not my problem with him. My worry about us not signing a striker is that we've left ourselves incredibly short to the point where one injury to Kai Havertz could kill us. It could kill us in terms of achieving something this season. People say, yeah, but it's the same with every team. If Liverpool lost Salah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. But if Liverpool lost Salah, they've got Cody Gakpo, who's scored as many goals as Kai Havertz has this season. So the level that they would be dropping down to is a much higher level. Our second top goal scorer is still Bukayo Saka on 9. So the drop-off is much bigger at Arsenal between number 1 and number 2. That isn't the case at Liverpool. They all need to provide output. It's not just about one man, and it's not just about a centre forward. A centre forward is needed because we are short of bodies that can play in that area. And so where I slightly disagree with the club's approach is when they go, yeah, but it ain't about bringing in bodies. It's about bringing in the right players. There's a part of me that agrees with the bringing in the right players part, but you also need options in that position. You need to be able to bring Kai Havertz off with 20 minutes to go in a game that you're comfortably winning to give him a breather. Arsenal are banking on putting Martinelli there or putting Trossard there or putting Raheem Sterling there or whatever. And that might work. That might work. But I have concerns about whether it will or not. And I have concerns about the implication of a Kai Havertz injury. He's not injured at the moment, touch wood. And so I'm not going to sit here and start effing and blinding. If that's what you're after, you're on the wrong channel. You're listening to the wrong podcast. That is not me. Okay, let's see how this plays out. Let's see how it goes. Do I agree with the decision not to bring in a striker? No. Would I have done something short term? Yes, I would have. If the situation dictated that I couldn't get one of my priority signings. To do nothing, I believe, is a massive rolling of the dice from Arsenal Football Club. And I sincerely hope that it doesn't come back to bite us. But that's just my opinion. And that's my opinion, which I acknowledge, by the way, is built upon the very limited understanding I have of what actually went on. I can only go by the reports that I read. I can only go by the whispers I hear when I'm covering a game at Arsenal. I don't know the ins and outs of it. Neither do you. So let's not go into outrage mode over something that we don't know. That's my issue. Let's take some of your questions and some of your points from the live chat. Gary Hardy says, our lack of attackers has already affected us this season. Saka needed some more rest and we could see him getting injured before it happened. Yeah. I think with Saka, right, it's clear that he's played too much football over the last few years. But then there's a part of me that thinks if you want to be really elite, you're going to have to play a lot of football because that's the way it works. Mo Salah does, and nobody seems to complain about that. I think the hope was that Raheem Sterling would be able to step up and provide him some cover. And the truth is, he's just not been at the level. And because of that, and because of the drop-off being so big, I think there's probably been a reluctance to make that change, to make that swap. I hope now, with the emergence of Ethan Nwaneri, that when Bukayo Saka does return, there'll be a bit more willingness on Mikel Arteta's part, maybe in a game or going into a game to say, you know what, Ethan, you have this one, mate. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, hopefully, let's see. Mario says that fair point is, Harry, they all need to provide more up top. Just talking about me saying about sharing the goals. DJ Ashby says, do you think Jason Ato is the right man for us going forward, or do you think they will definitely recruit externally for this position by the start of the window in the summer? So the truth is, I don't know, okay? Because I don't know anything about Jason Ato apart from what I hear he's done. And I understand that there will be a lot of people that go, well, what has he done? Because we've gone into January and we've not actually done any business. And we needed business. So the fact that we haven't done that business, it probably reflects to the wider sort of fan base quite badly on Jason Ato. But the truth is, we don't know how good he is at the job. We don't know if he's the right candidate. There comes a point as a fan where you have to accept that your knowledge is limited. And I'm in this boat too. I'm not pretending that I'm all high and mighty or any different to anybody else. You have to accept at times as a fan that you don't know everything. And if you don't know everything about anything in life, sometimes you have to place your faith and trust in someone else, right? If I get a plumber in to fix my boiler or a gas engineer to fix my boiler, and he comes in and he tells me it's this, this, and this, I don't have a clue. The reality is I don't know if that's the problem. So I have to put a bit of faith into that person, trusting that they would do the right thing and that they will solve the issue. And it's the same with this. We don't know on a day-to-day basis what Jason Ato does. We've not heard any of the conversations he's had with any of the prospective signings. We don't know what his relationship is like with the ownership. We don't know how closely he worked with Edu, how much of the good that Edu did was actually Jason Ato really sort of being heavily involved in that. We just don't know. So if the club come out tomorrow and say Jason Ato is the sporting director, I'm not going to kick up a fuss because I would have to trust that the club know that he is capable of doing the job. If they appoint someone else, then I have to trust in their belief that that person is a better candidate than Jason Ato. It's very, very, like when we talk about players, we've only got like some of the picture because we only see them in match situations, right? We don't know what they're like on the training ground. We don't know what the character's like all the time. And it can be quite difficult to judge. Now think about trying to judge members of the club's hierarchy. That's even harder because you've got even less of a picture. You would be judging these people on a few transfer deals every year and a few contract renewals or sales. You don't see them every week. What they do is not always tangible in terms of how you can view it and then go on to judge it. So it's a really difficult one, but it's a great question. It's a great question. Rumble says you've just told people to be optimistic and yet just contradicted yourself by saying one player goes down and we're screwed. No. Don't try and twist my words. I never said that everybody should be optimistic. I said that you are right to have a concern. Everybody who's concerned about what happens in the event that Kai Havertz picks up an injury is well within their rights to feel that way. And in my view, has a very, very valid point because I feel the same way. But the idea that we should sack this person and sack that person because we didn't get the signing, even though things could turn out all right, is mad. If things go south, let's deal with it. Let's look back at who's responsible. But let's not sort of crucify people before, what we perceive to be a mistake has even shown itself to be that, is my point. Don't try and twist my words and make out that I'm saying something I'm not. What else have we got in the chat? AJ says, so with the way the team is built, it doesn't even maximize its style. With Liverpool, Salah, Mane and Firmino all did their jobs. I think this comment cut off there. Sorry about that. I can't quite make sense of it because it cut off. Ivan says there's seemingly options for everyone except when it comes to Arsenal. Shaking my head. Okay. And this is open to everyone. If you're in the live chat box right now, and there are loads and loads of you with us live right now, which is amazing to see. Guys, please do, first of all, leave a like on the video. I'd really, really appreciate it. And subscribe to the channel if you're new. All of that stuff really, really does help. If you're listening on the audio platforms, then please do leave us a review. All of that stuff is really, really helpful too. And if you're watching us live on X right now, come over to the Chronicles of a Gooner YouTube channel or the podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever it is you get your pods. This is open to everyone. If you can tell me a striker who moved in this window that you think we should have had or should have got, let me know. Let me know. And then we'll break down how much they cost, whether that was the deal that was viable for us, etc., etc. Because that is a factor here as well, right? So I mentioned Alvaro Morata earlier on in the window, and he's gone to Galatasaray. That to me is one that we could have done. So that's kind of the one that I've got in mind. But aside from that, there aren't that many strikers on the move that you would say would improve us. I got to the point, as I admitted a little bit earlier on the show, where it wasn't about bringing in someone that would start ahead of Kai Havertz. It was about bringing in a supporting cast for him. That's how I saw it. And that comes out of desperation, doesn't it? When you get to that point, you should always be looking to improve. But if you can't, then you look at consolidating your position. And I hope that we would do that, but obviously we didn't. What else have we got? Jid says football fans are like people who watch game shows. It's easy shouting at your screen. Watching, what's that? Acting like you know all the answers when in actuality you only shout at 2 out of 15 questions. Oh, who wants to be a millionaire? I think is what he's referencing. And he then goes on to say, this is because fans have the luxury of getting things wrong and not having to face consequences. Everyone's an armchair manager because when they get it wrong, they can pretend they never held the view. It's true. It's true. Ivan says, would you have taken a midfield signing instead, since it seems we have a lot of holes to fill in the summer due to the departures like Jorginho and Partey? I think it's likely that both of those go in the summer. It's just my opinion. I don't know that for fact. I know that Jorginho, from what we've read, has been in conversations with clubs in Brazil, and Partey's contract situation, I think, from what I understand, is undecided at the moment. So yeah, you know, we've heard about Zubimendi. We're hoping that deal materializes, and if it does, then that's one of those roles filled. But we'd obviously need to probably go and bring in another one. Is there a future for Miles Lewis-Skelly in midfield? I wouldn't mind seeing that. I really like him when he goes into the middle of the pitch. So yeah, that's an option as well, right? And it's important that you don't block the pathways of these players as well, as long as they are good enough. And he definitely is good enough, and he's a real talent, real talent. Okay, look, I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna sign out. I'm gonna go put my feet up and chill. Thank you to everybody who joined in on the live stream. Thank you to everybody who will be either watching this or listening to this back. Great piece written by James McNicholas of The Athletic, which has been the kind of basis of today's podcast. There are things that, if you read this account, I think Arsenal were right to do. And there are things that, in my personal opinion, I think they were wrong to do. It's a game of opinions. All my point is, you know, we're going to have to get creative in that forward line. Mikel Arteta admitted as much today. You know, we're going to have to find different solutions. We're going to have to try different things. We're going to have to use different players in those positions, because it's unrealistic to expect Kai Havertz to carry that burden entirely on his own. But stick with the team, get behind the team. And if we have to revisit this window to identify where, if indeed it happens, our season fell apart, then we can attack it with a little bit more vigor and a little bit more conviction. To attack someone for something that hasn't happened yet and isn't guaranteed to happen is a mindset that I don't think I'll personally ever understand. It's like getting annoyed with the guy at the traffic lights that hasn't hit your car yet, but might hit your car. Like, what? So yeah, look, just that's what. Look, the window's done, right? So forget about it. We can talk about it until I'm blue in the face. It won't make the slightest bit of difference. The business is done. We've got a massive game coming up on Wednesday night. We've got a trip to Newcastle that, if we can win convincingly and we can sort of turn that deficit around, we're going to a Wembley final, which wouldn't be bad, would it, for a club that are having a crisis season, as people like to put it. So anyway, the window's done. Draw a line under it now. I'm barely going to talk about it now. I'm going to talk about it if it comes back to bite us in the arse, because I think that certain problems, if we do encounter them, will lead back to this. But for now, focus on the team, focus on what we can control, what we can do on the pitch. And as fans, we can get behind and we can support. That's what we need to be doing. And Mikel Arteta needs to focus on the players that he has as well, because that's his job. He can't sit there now worrying about what might have happened and dreaming about who he might have signed. He seemed pretty relaxed today about it all, to be honest with you, which doesn't mean necessarily that he's entirely pleased or satisfied with what he has. But it does, I think, tell you that at the very least, he is confident that the club did actually do everything they could to bring him the players that he was looking at and that the club were looking at. Obviously, they had their limits, like on the Watkins thing. They clearly weren't going to pay the money that maybe Mikel Arteta would have liked them to pay. But there seems to be a sort of, I don't know what the right word is. Like, he seems to be quite content in the fact that they did try and it didn't happen. And it is what it is. There wasn't a frustration coming across from Mikel Arteta. Either he's a really good actor, or I just got that sense that he was at least satisfied that they tried. And, you know, you don't always succeed in everything that you try in life. I know that better than anybody. But anyway, thank you all so much for joining me. We'll be back tomorrow morning, Wednesday morning, that is. If you're listening to this on Wednesday, ignore me, ignore the times, ignore the dates. They're all over the place. If you're listening to this later on, ignore me. We'll be back on the next episode with a preview of that Newcastle United game, which should be, given Arsenal's confidence, having just thrashed Manchester City, a bit of a firecracker. I'll catch you all then. Take care. Goodbye.